Welcome to this afternoon's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, Lindsay, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third installment in ASP's Innovating Out of the Climate Crisis series. My name is Lindsay Iversen. I'm an Adjunct Senior Fellow here at ASP. This program of events and papers is highlighting the innovations, challenges, and opportunities in 5 clean energy areas that are essential to pivoting away from fossil fuels. For today's discussion on carbon management, we're thrilled to welcome just a really fantastic panel of experts. In alphabetical order and in ascending length of job title, we have Jack Andreasen, who's Manager of Carbon Management and U.S. Policy and Advocacy at Breakthrough Energy, Antonia Gavel, Head of Climate Change and Deputy Head of the Center for Nature and Climate at the World Economic Forum, fresh back from Davos and hopefully well rested, and Jennifer Wilcox, who's Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the U.S. Department of Energy. Thank you all so much for being here today. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'll kick things off and weave in audience questions from the Q&A box as we go. So Jen, I'd like to start with you and just with the basics if we can. There's a lot of acronyms and jargon in this space: carbon capture, carbon removal, CCS, CCUS. Can you give us just a brief overview of some of the key differences among these technologies, and then tell us a little bit about how we should think about their potential contributions to emissions reductions overall?
Sure. Thanks again for having me here today. Excited about this discussion. When we think about carbon capture or carbon management more broadly, it does have a lot of different components. There's the concept of capturing carbon at a source. In other words, preventing its release from entering the atmosphere to begin with. And we can think about the power sector in doing that, looking at existing power plants today and retrofitting them with carbon capture technology. You can look at industrial emissions like cement plants or pulp and paper. And in all of those cases, you're really just avoiding the CO2 from entering the atmosphere. And then with approaches like removal, carbon dioxide removal, that's when we're tackling the CO2 that's accumulating in the atmosphere. And so it's a very difficult problem because the CO2 is 100 to 400 times more dilute in the atmosphere. So you've just got to process a lot more inert gas, oftentimes nitrogen, in order to separate the CO2. One synergy or overlap with the approaches is that you still have to be able to manage the CO2 once you capture it. Whether it's from the atmosphere or a point source, you have to do something with it in a way that's permanent and durable so that it doesn't re-enter the atmosphere, so we can have positive impacts on climate. And that piece is, often geologic storage is something where there's the capacity and the durability such that that CO2 is stored on a timescale that is relevant, up to thousands of years. But there's also utilization pathways where the CO2 can be used as a chemical feedstock. In some of those cases, though, the CO2 is re-emitted in the atmosphere. In some cases, it could be converted to building materials. And so that's a whole different suite of technologies. But that's really the broad portfolio of carbon management.
Thank you. I want to stick with just carbon capture for the moment. There's only about 20 carbon capture and storage facilities in operation worldwide, roughly. The bipartisan infrastructure law dedicated $2.5 billion to developing new technologies and to changing that. How's that going? What do you see the future there?
Well, I'll update just a little bit. So. Sure. There's actually about $12 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law associated broadly of carbon management, roughly $2.5 billion associated with the geologic storage piece. Mm-hmm. So really building out the capacity to store CO2 in the subsurface in a dedicated way. And then there's $3.5 billion associated with the build out of direct air capture hubs. Each of those hubs, we're estimating there's going to be 4 of them, and each of those will scale up to about 1 million tons of removal per year. And the remainder funding is really associated with that point source carbon capture that I talked about. And so we have about $1 billion associated with pilots, large pilots, and then several $billion associated with in particular, at least 6 projects where we're looking at point source capture, avoiding the emissions from entering the atmosphere. 2 associated with industrial sectors. So I mentioned cement, but it might be pulp and paper, or in some cases, steel is a good example. And then 4 associated with the power sector. And so there's a lot of funding with the bipartisan infrastructure law. These are first of a kind projects. And the government is really going to be subsidizing up to 50% of the capital expense. And the other piece of legislation that's super important, which I'm sure we're going to get to talk about today too, is the Inflation Reduction Act. And so that is a critical element, because these projects that I'm talking about aren't going to get us to the scale we need to. So we're going to need the private sector, and we're going to need economic incentives to really get us the rest of the way.
Yeah. Thank you. You've teed up, I think, 3 or 4 of my follow-up questions. So that's terrific. Well done. But I want to pause for just a minute. I mean, one of the questions or criticisms that you often hear of carbon capture technologies is that, you know, they sort of artificially extend the lives of fossil fuel industries, you know, particularly in the power sector, but not necessarily exclusively, where people say, you know, look, we need to be getting ourselves off of these fuels. We need to be transitioning to cleaner energy. And this is just kind of a Band-Aid for sectors that, you know, for fossil fuel companies. How do you respond to that? What would you say to critics of the technologies?
Well, in these 6 projects that we're looking at in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're really looking at responsible siting of CCS. When you look at retrofitting power plants like natural gas or coal, you are enabling our dependence on fossil fuels. And so you really have to be careful as you're retrofitting with CCS, what are the upstream impacts? And so in the case of natural gas, it's a little bit more complicated. We're really dependent on natural gas in a lot of different ways to heat our homes, commercial, residential heating, industrial heating, but also power generation. And when you look at the fleet of natural gas-fired power plants in the United States, it's relatively young compared to the coal-fired power plants. And so recognizing that those emissions, the CO2 emissions, are actually going to persist through mid-century unless some of those newer plants are retired really early, much earlier than they're even, you know, the capital investment in them. So it may not economically make sense to do that. And it may be more economic to, of course, to retrofit them with carbon capture. The other piece is that we need to make sure that communities have reliable energy. And so I think one of the, you know, the mission of our office is really thinking about investing in technologies so that we have reliable access to energy across all parts of the United States, but also that that energy is clean and that it's affordable. And so in terms of upstream, we are also investing in methane quantification, methane mitigation, recognizing when you're producing natural gas that there's emissions associated, whether it's venting, flaring, or leaks. And so being able to quantify that and making sure that industry has access to economic tools and resources to avoid the methane emissions upstream. The other piece I would say is that there's a lot of concern when you look at not just the power sector, but also the industrial sector. There are other co-pollutants. It's not just about CO2. There's acid gases like SOx and NOx and particulate matter. And so one of the things that we're doing at DOE is we're really encouraging applicants and the technology providers to be thinking about co-pollutants, not just CO2, but a technology that can also prevent the emissions of other acid gases and particulate matter. And so that's something that we're encouraging and really requesting that applicants monitor co-pollutants so that we can understand baselines, and that a benefit to a community can actually be an overall reduction of pollution when you retrofit with carbon capture. So these are some of the ways that we're thinking about responsible siting of CCS and how it can really improve the quality of the air when we look at these investments.
Interesting, thank you. Jack, I want to turn to you next. One of the most commonly cited reasons for the slow deployment of both carbon capture, but also carbon removal technologies is cost. Last year's Inflation Reduction Act, which Jen alluded to, includes a pretty significant expansion in federal support for those systems. Can you tell us a little bit about what you see as the most important changes in that law, and then say a bit about what impact you think they'll have on deployment?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again, Lindsay, for having me on. I think, as Jen also previously mentioned, there's a number of different pieces of federal support for the total value chain of CCS. And so it's important to note when we talk about cost, in particular with, I'll talk about in a moment, the 45Q tax credit, which was in the Inflation Reduction Act. The federal government investment in this is actually driving down total systems cost, whether it's in the storage aspect, transportation infrastructure, feed studies. So although 45Q is what's often brought out as a key financial mechanism, it's important to note that a number of investments driving down costs across the system, which is so important to get this technology more deployed and in the ground. So in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act included enhancements to a piece of the tax code called 45Q. 45Q is a piece of the code which allows for payment to companies that are able to demonstrate that they've sequestered CO2 safely in a geologic reservoir or utilized in a long-term product, something potentially like concrete. And so the important changes in the law is one, it has been, but it is a 12-year program. Just for background information, so this has a runtime of 12 years. The dollar amount for dedicated CO2 storage, so CO2 that's captured from an industrial facility or a power generation facility, is $85, which is an increase. And then in usage, so this could be, again, CO2 captured and put into concrete, is at $60. Another change was the inclusion of direct air capture at $180 a ton for dedicated storage and $130 a ton for utilization. I think one of the most.
And can you give us, sorry to interrupt, but like just that was a pretty significant increase, right? Like, can you give us a sense of where it started? Like, how is this a lot? And how will those dollar amounts help make the technologies competitive?
Yeah. So this is, almost a doubling in some cases, and direct air capture is a new, completely new carve out for 45Q. And really, this is with conversations in industry about what level they needed these tax credits at to be able to deploy CCS on these facilities. These, at the end of the day, these companies need an incentive to be able to capture the carbon, and the levels that were set in the Inflation Reduction Act are justified by the appropriate investment needed in order to capture the CO2. So yeah, it's a huge investment in terms of an increase, and just outside of the dollar amount increase that will allow companies to make these large capital investments on CCS technologies is the what's called direct pay. So previously for 45Q, in order to monetize the tax credit, you had to go to tax equity markets. So large companies or entities that have a tax appetite that would like to decrease their tax incidence. And then you took a haircut on tax equity deals, which just means whatever the tax credit is, let's say in this case, $85, you would pay anywhere from 10 to 20% off the top of that. So $8.50 or $17 in the tax equity deals. Now, what direct pay does is essentially allowing these companies to receive this money back in the same way that you would receive money in your own personal tax return if you received money back. And so direct pay essentially allows the full monetization of this tax credit rather than having to take a haircut and it'd be less efficient by going to the tax equity markets. So direct pay is available for up to 5 years unless you're a not-for-profit or a tribe. And then direct pay is available for the full 12 years of a program, which I think will create some really interesting opportunities for organizations that can receive the full 12 years of direct pay. Sort of two other big changes are the date of commencing construction. So you can now receive 45Q, provided that the construction has started in 2033. Although CCS is mature technology in some industries, it's less mature in others, and allowing these technologies to be able to go through research, development, deployment, pilots, et cetera, over the course of these next 10 years, de-risks that technology and allows for that to move up the scale of technological readiness. And then finally, this 45Q is indexed to inflation post 2026. So you're not going to have inflation eating into the credit amount after 2026. So broadly speaking, I think 45Q is the single most important financial mechanism for carbon capture and direct air capture, given the length of the credit, the lack of a cap, so there's no cap on the amount of credits that you can claim, the increasing the amounts, the direct pay, and the commence construction date being pushed back to 2033. I mean, fundamentally, what we're talking about here is it provides dedicated offtake agreements, which de-risk the technology for more traditional risk-averse financial institutions, traditional banking, right? And so carbon capture and DAC are large capital expensive projects, and 45Q gives them dedicated revenue stream, that capital needed, that they can go out and secure more favorable financing. And it's been a success. You've already seen announcements of a natural gas combined cycle carbon capture facility in West Virginia. Net Power has announced a new facility for their alum cycle power in Texas. The carbon capture hub for industrial applications that's going on in the Gulf. Occidental Petroleum 1.5 announcing a number of different direct air capture facilities across the state of Texas. So really, this change in law has and will continue to spur growth in crucial climate technologies that are CCS and DAC.
Terrific, thank you. And if we have time, I want to come back to the Texas question and talk a little bit about enhanced oil recovery, but we'll maybe come back to that. Antonia, I wanted to come to you now, if we can, and particularly about carbon removal and the role of the private sector in all of this. So one of your hats at the World Economic Forum is head of the First Movers Coalition, which is working to boost private sector involvement in this activity. First of all, can you tell us what is the First Movers Coalition for those who don't know? And then how does its work complement or fit in with the public sector initiatives that we've been talking about so far?
Yeah, happy to, and great to be here with all of you. Let me dive in on that. I will just quickly sort of pick up and comment on some of the previous remarks. I think it is important to sort of see DAC and CCS in the bigger portfolio of carbon management solutions, so that we don't sort of lose sight of the full picture of things that we need to do. And I think in that, it's recognizing that actually addressing emissions at source is probably the single most important thing we need to keep doing. So scaling available commercial technologies, renewables, enhanced storage, to really draw down at source. I think at the same time, as was noted, there are emissions that aren't simply going to go away tomorrow. So what do we do about those emissions in the near term so that they're not sort of continuing to exist at that scale for the next 30 years, given the capital expenditure in some of these facilities, which is where these types of solutions come in. And indeed, even the IPCC has now said we need DAC, we need direct air capture, we need to start pulling emissions out of the atmosphere, in addition to preventing further emissions from existing facilities. So we have to sort of think about those two realities. The economics, though, are very different. The economics for how you invest in source renewables is very different from what you're looking at when it comes to capture technologies, just because it's a different structure completely. The incentive is basically really not there in a logical sense unless you put in place these types of really push mechanisms to get the businesses to invest, because the carbon pricing isn't actually there to push that at the scale or level needed, which would be another approach, of course, as well. Now, I think coming to your question, so the First Movers Coalition really looks across the full suite of industrial emissions. So looking at 30% of global emissions, which is everything from cement, concrete, including direct air capture, but also long kind of trucking emissions, shipping, et cetera. So we're looking at the suite of 7 or so technology areas. And the theory of change behind, I guess you could say, the First Movers Coalition is saying that, look, by 2030, about half of the technologies that we need to decarbonize, mostly at source again, are not yet even close to competitive or at commercial scale. And at the same time, the economics are also not there in terms of the incentive or the risk-taking willingness for a lot of the private sector players to invest. They're big capital expenditures. The suppliers, the innovators of these types of solutions aren't necessarily kind of jumping over themselves to invest. And yet we need them to scale. And if we don't move something now, we're in this chicken and egg situation, then there's no chance that we're going to have the technologies that we need by 2030. And so that's where the First Movers Coalition said, look, if we create a big enough demand signal, so if we get enough prospective buyers of these technologies to make significant commitments to invest, then hopefully that will unlock, let's say, the willingness to invest in that infrastructure through advanced purchasing commitments, offtake agreements that equally help secure the finance to actually bring those projects to life as well. And right now we have about 70 companies, about $12 billion in demand commitments on the table. And the work this year is really trying to what we call evidence supply, transition kind of the demand into, okay, where are those projects going to come from? Where will they be? How can we support and facilitate that investment? And to your point about where does the public sector policy come in, it's completely critical, right? You can create a first mover movement, but you then absolutely need the public policy to kick in behind it, which will enable scale and enable not just sort of pilot projects, but actually the ability to make it truly economic or even speed up the price reduction rate that we expect as technologies advance. It'll make it happen much more quickly. We saw that in renewables in the early 2000s. It was a combination of public policy, investments, coupled with then the growth of the infrastructure, the technology, where prices quickly came down. I think the hope is that we can do that with industrial technologies. But again, these are larger scale investments, bigger kind of risk-taking activities that are being undertaken. And so I think the policies, the Infrastructure Reduction Act in the US has made a huge difference in terms of at least what we've heard from the companies in terms of their real readiness to actually move to put money on the ground to then help them actually meet their purchase commitments that they've set out. We also have 12 other governments, or I guess 11 plus 1 US, so 12 governments that we're working with around the world on this, again, with the hope that you bring the kind of willingness, the purchasing power of the private sector to the table, and then say, okay, government, if you match this with the right policy support and incentives, then suddenly your system can move quite quickly. So that's sort of where we're moving.
And can you, you mentioned sort of the mechanism of being advanced purchase mechanisms. Can you maybe just, for those who don't know what that is, can you just give a sort of very brief definition? And then you talked about how companies were starting to move towards implementing some of these advanced commitments. What are the technologies they're most excited about? Like, where are you seeing the money actually go?
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of advanced purchase commitments, it would be something like, a company making a commitment to offtake to offtake a certain amount of emissions from direct air capture. And it would be basically saying to a technology provider, I will do a contract with you for 2025, where in 2025, I expect to capture this. I expect you for me to capture this much CO2, which then gives them the ability to take that contract to the finance sector and say, look, I have a contract. Will you now finance me to expand my facility? And if you can grow enough of these types of contracts, it just enables then really the technology, the supply side, to build the capacity that we need to see move. So that forward investment, the forward commitments, is where hopefully that can make a big difference in terms of technology scale. Your second question in terms of the types of technologies. Now, I mean, for the First Movers Coalition, the way that we've scoped this is basically kind of based on, well, science and decarbonization pathways. So what we did is say, look, we'll work with the best experts in the world to say, look, what are truly the technologies and what is the scale of, let's say, emissions that we're trying to get to in each of these sectors, be it shipping or steel or cement and concrete, all the different sectors. Like, what qualifies, quote unquote, as the type of technology that, based on their assessments, by 2030 needs to be scaled in order to meet those decarbonization pathways. And that's the scope of technology that we've included in FMC. There might be other types of solutions that our companies are investing in that are out of scope because the science says actually, no, that's not quite where we need to be on the decarbonization pathway. So we've tried to kind of keep it focused on that. So an example would be for sustainable aviation fuels, what we've said is, look, it has to be 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for SAF. There is SAF that exists today, 10 to 15%. We're nowhere, we don't have 85%, but the whole point is that this is an innovation pull initiative. It's not about scaling what we can do today. It's about, okay, how do we really pull the types of solutions that don't exist that we know we need through this type of purchasing commitment. And, the reality is a lot of these investments don't exist at scale. At the same time, things like green steel, at least based on the assessments that we see and hear, we have more demand right now, or the sort of assessment suggests that there's more demand for true green steel. So based on renewable sourced hydrogen and sort of shifting the process emissions are sold. So we actually have a lag in available supply based on the demand, which is pretty good investment proposition if you ask me. You have willing buyers. A lot of the automotive companies have committed to this. And so an opportunity really to scale those solutions.
Thank you. We've got a question from the audience, which talks about the role of ocean carbon removal and natural carbon solutions. So Jen, I wondered if I could come back to you about this. Natural carbon removal approaches are a prominent part of the DOE suite of technologies that you're funding under the carbon removal Earthshot. So maybe can you talk a little bit about what technologies are included under that umbrella and how you're thinking about the nature-based ones in particular?
Sure. So at COP in 2021, we did launch our carbon negative shot, which includes the broad portfolio of carbon removal approaches. So not just the engineering-based ones, but mineral-based, ocean-based, the land-based sectors, everything's included. And it's not just an FECM, Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Initiative, it's across all of DOE. And so what we're doing is we're taking base appropriations that go into each of the offices and we're compiling those. So cumulatively tens to hundreds of millions of dollars each year that are going to be invested in the carbon negative shot. And our hope is after, roughly a decade of investment that we can actually get the scale from thousands of tons removal today to millions of tons over the next decade in terms of robust carbon removal. So that term robust is key. And so when you look at the nature-based approaches, it's really difficult to be able to quantify how much carbon is really removed. It's difficult to be able to prove that projects are additional. And so what we're looking at is also investing in robust monitoring, reporting, and verification of the approaches so that they can be quantified, so that the carbon removals can be quantified and maybe monetized. When we look at, Jack mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act and 45Q getting bumped up to $180 for direct air capture. The reason we can do that is we can quantify, that's an engineering-based approach. And we take the CO2 and we inject it in a well deep underground. All of that is required through what's called a Class 6 permit, which is a permit approved through the Environmental Protection Agency. And it comes with monitoring, reporting, and verification. So the framework is in place to allow us to have the support we need to incentivize through Inflation Reduction Act and 45Q direct air capture, but we don't have that for the other approaches, the nature-based approaches. So we recognize it, and we're trying to create that framework so that it's robust. And then ultimately there can be incentives for the nature-based solutions too.
So can you say a little bit about what might go into that framework? I mean, how are you thinking about, whether a forest burns or not, or how do you measure the ocean? I mean, what are some of the criteria that you're thinking about?
So right now we have a funding opportunity announcement that we've released back in December that's leveraging the national labs to help develop the technology, whether it's sensing or, the ability to quantify the emissions. But there's another element that you bring up. And if you're thinking about a forest project, where can you plant trees today that are low risk of reversing? and creating emissions? And that's kind of an outstanding question. When you look at forests that exist today, how do you improve forest management to increase uptake, but also a co-benefit would be to avoid forest fires? What does that forest management approach look like? And so these questions are still outstanding of what are the metrics that need to be included in the MRV plan. And so we're working with the labs to try and leverage them. The labs are, regionally spaced across the United States and have, equities. Some are already engaged, in efforts associated with ocean storage, like increasing the alkalinity of the ocean, for instance, to capture CO2 that's dissolved in seawater, with a co-benefit of reducing ocean acidification. And so there's already some work in place in these spaces, but we're trying to make the quantification more rigorous and the tools available for these projects as they move forward.
Interesting, thank you. Jack, I think I want to come back to you if I can. The subtext of a lot of what we've talked about today is that we'll need to build a lot of plants and pipelines and storage facilities and all the kinds of things that people just love to have in their backyards. I think we can expect permitting to be a pretty serious issue in building out this industry. Is permitting reform still on the table, or how is Congress or the agencies thinking about addressing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it depends on sort of what kind of permit you're looking to get. Obviously, in the CCS stack world, as Jen mentioned, the Class 6 permits are the things that are most often discussed in this area. I think it's important to note that geologic storage is an incredibly safe technology. Hundreds of millions of tons have been stored underground with no major leaks since the 1990s. We've been doing this for a long time. We know exactly how to do it. We know the risks associated with it. And the Environmental Protection Agency has an incredibly robust permitting program that ensures the safety of the public as the CO2 is injected underground. In terms of the number of permits that will be necessary to achieve sort of climate goals, but net zero by 2050, for example, there are going to need to be more permits that go out the door, and these permits are going to have to be issued at a faster rate than they've been done historically. But there's no reason to think that shouldn't be a possibility. Right now, with the new increases to 45Q, this is going to necessitate that more permits will be going into the permit process. The EPA is aware of this. They knew this was happening. They've staffed up appropriately and are working on these permits. Outside of making sure that people are reading the EPA's suggestions and templatized permitting things that they have on their website to make this situation go smoother, constant communication with the EPA can happen, needs to happen in order for these permits to go more smoothly. And then there's also other mechanisms. So one, that there's actually funding for in the Infrastructure Act was for what's called primacy. And this is the idea that a state would be able to have their own permitting program for Class 6 wells. Now, most states in the United States have permitting, already have primacy for Class 1 through Class 5 wells. And it's really Class 6 that is unique in the fact that not many states have primacy, only 2 do, North Dakota and Wyoming. And there's $50 million available to help states stand up a primacy program and support North Dakota and Wyoming in their primacy that they already have. Now, what this does essentially is it allows states that are able to prove they have just a robust technical capacity to permit Class 6 wells, as the EPA has. It allows the states to do it in-house, essentially, with their own Department of Environmental Quality. Which lessens the burden on federal administrators here. So between the EPA has already put tools online to help people with permitting, has staffing appropriately alongside this route that states could go to achieve primacy. The permitting and the necessary changes, some of them are in place, and really we'll need to see over the course of the next couple of years the speed at which these applications get out. That'll tell us how successful these efforts have been.
Yeah, thank you. I'm surprised Iowa is not one of those states. That's interesting. There's a question in the Q&A box that I think speaks to that is adjacent to some of these issues, which talks about, whether injecting CO2 into the geological reservoirs would affect groundwater quality. Now we kind of talk about these technologies as being very new and cutting edge. Jack, you just referenced them being actually really well tested. I think, for enhanced oil recovery, they've been used since sort of the 1970s, I think. So Jack or Jen, or, does anybody want to sort of jump in and talk about, maybe what happens when CO2 is injected underground, like, and how deep underground is it? Like, what does this well actually look like? How does it work?
Do you want me to take a shot at that, Jack? Okay. Just like you said, we've been putting CO2 in the subsurface since the 70s. So this isn't something that's new. It's not something that's novel. And because we've been doing that, we've developed the tools to be able to monitor the CO2 plume underground. And so we can see it. We can see where it's going. We can also recognize that how it's being stored, like what does that even look like? What does that even mean is really important. So a lot of times when you look at the rocks, the reservoir rocks that produce oil and gas, those trapping mechanisms that have stored oil and gas for millions of years are the same trapping mechanisms that are going to be storing supercritical CO2. So CO2 in this condensed phase, and you asked about depths, a mile underground. And so these are very distant from the groundwater. And so it's not, at the same time, there's concerns, right? And you want to get ahead of any kind of risks if there's a seismic activity in the future. And so that's why being able to have the tools to monitor the plume in the subsurface and how it's even changing in terms of its durability of storage over time. And those trapping mechanisms change. In the near term, the CO2 can dissolve into water and even pinch off into a separate phase. So water that's in the reservoir rock, not to be confused with groundwater that's used for drinking. And over time, in fact, hundreds to thousands of years, the CO2 ultimately mineralizes. So the longer the CO2 is in the subsurface, the actual, the higher, or I'll say the lower the risk is for leakage. And so the trapping mechanisms become more and more advanced as the CO2 is in the subsurface. But the one thing I want to mention is that the Department of Energy has been investing in this space for like 3 decades, investing in technology so that we can monitor and get ahead of any kind of risks. And we have a program called Carbon Safe. And what it does is we invest at different phases. And so if there is at any one point leakage or seismic event, there's no go stages. So you can stop a project before it actually gets to a final phase. That's not the case necessarily with privately funded projects, but that is how the DOE is doing it in a very phased approach so that we can get ahead of any kind of risks.
Interesting, thank you. One of the, I'm just, sorry, I'm looking back and forth between you and the Q&A questions. I want to make sure we get as many from our audience as we can. One of our audience members has asked about injecting CO2 into concrete as carbonate, which is something that has been alluded to a couple of times during the conversation. And I think opens the door to talking about utilization, which we haven't really touched on very much so far. So maybe just as a starter, how does it work? How when we inject CO2 into cement, like how does that store the cement? My understanding is that it also makes the cement stronger. And so,
Happy to jump in.
Sure.
So we've got to be careful to not conflate cement with concrete.
Okay.
So cement is produced, it's pretty much like calcium oxide or magnesium oxide from heating limestone to really high temperatures. And it's a glue is what you can think of for making concrete. And so the 3 ingredients of concrete are cement, sand and gravel, and water. And so there's different ways to think about how to use the CO2 in concrete. And so one way is to actually make synthetic aggregate. And in the chat, we see somebody talking about carbonates. So you could replace sand and gravel with a synthetic sand and gravel, which is just like a carbonate. And that's really a good way because it can store a lot of carbon in that way. But there are companies that instead of curing with water, they can cure with CO2. And so that's another approach in curing concrete with CO2. But the amount of CO2 stored, the amount of carbon stored in that process is much smaller than the potential with the carbonate route.
And what is the storage potential with the carbonate route, roughly?
It can be pretty significant. Somebody asked in the chat whether or not it could offset the emissions associated with the mining of the limestone. Absolutely, it can do that. But it can also, depending on how, when you look at that calcining process and the fuel that goes into calcining, a lot of people, don't recognize that a lot of the emissions associated with making cement are process emissions, because you're taking limestone and you're heating it and you're chemically producing CO2. And then there's a smaller portion that's associated with the thermal, like the energy, that you need for the kiln to run, like using coal or natural gas. And so you have to look at what's the carbon intensity of the whole process, grinding limestone, the thermal and process emissions of creating the cement. And there are, especially with fuel switching with biomass coupled to carbon capture, you can even make, at the end of the day, concrete that's carbon negative when you look at that whole balance. So it has really significant potential depending on how you stack the different approaches.
That's terrific. Antonia, I wanted to use utilization to come back to you. For the companies who are involved, particularly in the direct air capture part of the First Movers Coalition, is utilization sort of one of the pull factors that's bringing them in? Are they looking at it as a future potential business opportunity, or when they go back to their boards or their shareholders, how do they sell to their stakeholders, hey, we just invested $1 billion in this technology?
Yeah, so in terms of the direct air capture, let's say, scope of solutions that at least in the context of FMC we're looking at, it's probably some of the former technologies that were spoken about. So it's really looking at technological removals that really have that 1,000+ year durability. Things like engineered solutions, also hybrid natural processes like enhanced weathering, mineralization. So it's sort of, let's say, that type of solution that is trying to be pulled through that specific commitment. How are they making the case that this is, let's say, a viable investment? I think that, again, companies and I think all of us recognize that it's a both and situation, in the sense that in order to meet the actual net zero decarbonization goals that the companies have, on one hand, the critical path is direct decarbonization, which includes some of those utilization solutions, right? So if you're then, for example, engaged in cement and concrete, if you're looking at other types of technologies that have the ability to capture carbon, that actually naturally will have to be part of the decarbonization solutions for those sectors. And in addition, technological removals will be also needed, just based on kind of the pathways that we see. So it's really to say that if you're quote unquote serious about actually meeting your decarbonization goals by 2050, 50% by 2030, it really has to look at all of these different, let's say, technologies and solutions in parallel. It's not, unfortunately, so much either or anymore. It might have been either or kind of a decade or two ago, but that's not the environment we see ourselves in now. Now, the cost of kind of the technological removals is exorbitant right now. It's really expensive in the sense that there's nowhere near a CO2 price that actually justifies those investments. So the challenge is, how do you bring that down? There's various ways to do that, of course, incentive to help kind of support the investments, but also long-term, there is going to need to be more, let's say, significant long-term pricing on carbon to actually make it a viable solution, because otherwise you're sort of, incentivized to kind of invest up front, but again, kind of carbon capture is a net cost. So so that's where we need to think about, on one hand, bringing the price of the technology down by really putting investment support up front. But I think we do also need to think about that slightly longer term, let's say, incentive approach that will help keep those technologies running as well. It's not just about the capital investment that will support kind of the scale of those technologies.
Yeah, carbon pricing, the solution that we keep reaching for.
In other ways of pricing,
Sure.
you don't have to have a quote unquote price on carbon in the way that other economies do, but there's various, mechanisms to do that, be it related to tax and other incentives. But but it has to be more than investment in infrastructure, I suppose, is where I'm coming from for these technologies.
Well, we have reached the end of our time. Thank you very much to our panelists, I think, for a really terrific discussion. I've learned a lot. I hope all of you have as well. To those of you in the chat who haven't had a chance to have your questions answered, I apologize, but thank you so much for your participation. And keep an eye out in your inboxes for invitations to future events in this series and to other events from ASP. But in the meantime, thank you again for coming today. And that's the end of our program.